A single wrong turn ignited the First World War. History often pivots not on grand plans, but on one unpredictable moment. We are about to uncover 30 of these pivotal instants, the split-second decisions and chance events that sent our world down a completely different path. You will discover the hidden connections between a forgotten assassination, a moldy Petri dish, and a spark in a California river. How did a broken love affair rewrite the future of the British monarchy? What did a monk nailing a paper to a door ultimately unleash? By the end, you will see the fragile threads upon which our entire reality hangs. What other single moment do you believe secretly shaped our modern world? That single wrong turn in Sarajevo placed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne directly in the path of a young assassin. On a sunny June morning, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were visiting the city when a bomb was thrown at their motorcade. It injured members of their escort, but the Archduke was unharmed. Furious, he insisted on visiting the hospital to check on the wounded officers. It was on the way to that hospital that his driver took a fateful wrong turn, stalling the car right in front of a cafe where one of the failed assassins, Gavrilo Princip, happened to be standing. Seizing the unbelievable second chance, Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. The Archduke and his wife were dead within minutes. This was the spark. Europe at the time was a tinderbox of interlocking alliances, a complex web of promises that guaranteed if one nation went to war, others would be forced to follow. Austria-Hungary, backed by its powerful ally Germany, delivered a brutal ultimatum to Serbia, holding the entire nation responsible for the assassination. When Serbia's reply failed to satisfy them, Austria-Hungary declared war. But Serbia was secretly allied with the vast Russian Empire, which began to mobilize its army. This prompted Germany to declare war on Russia, and because Russia was allied with France, Germany then declared war on France too, launching a massive invasion through neutral Belgium. That invasion of Belgium brought the British Empire into the conflict, bound by a treaty to protect Belgian neutrality. In just a few weeks, a single act of terrorism by a teenage nationalist had pulled all the great powers into a war no one truly wanted, yet no one could stop. What began as a regional dispute in the Balkans exploded into the First World War, a catastrophic conflict that would shatter empires, redraw the map of the world, and create the unstable conditions that would lead to an even greater war a generation later. That single spark in Sarajevo lit a fire that consumed empires, but another world-altering event arrived not with a gunshot but with a whisper on the wind. 4 trading ships from the Genoese port of Kaffa docked at the Sicilian harbor of Messina in October of 1347. The sailors on board were already dying, their bodies covered in oozing black boils that gave the disease its terrifying name, the Black Death. This was not a war of nations, but a silent invasion by a bacterium carried by fleas on black rats. Within days, the pestilence leaped from the ships into the city, and from there it began a relentless march across the European continent. The symptoms were a horrifying spectacle. Victims developed sudden fevers, then painful swellings called buboes in their groins and armpits. These would grow, often turning black as tissue died before the afflicted succumbed in agony. There was no cure, no understanding of how it spread. The disease cut down rich and poor, young and old, with a terrifying randomness. Within just 5 years, an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population had perished. Imagine entire villages standing empty, fields left fallow, and the constant drone of funeral bells. The sheer scale of death was incomprehensible, a trauma that scarred the collective European psyche forever. Yet from this unimaginable devastation, a new world was forced to emerge. The feudal system, the rigid structure where lords owned the land and peasants worked it in exchange for protection, completely collapsed. Why? Because there was a catastrophic shortage of labor. So many peasants had died that those who survived suddenly found their work in high demand. For the first time, they could demand higher wages and better conditions. They could leave the lands they were once bound to and seek opportunity elsewhere. The power dynamic between the nobility and the common people shifted irrevocably. This societal upheaval also shattered the unquestioned authority of the Church. Prayers and pilgrimages had done nothing to stop the plague. Why had God allowed this to happen? The failure of the clergy to provide answers or protection led to widespread disillusionment and a crisis of faith. This spiritual vacuum allowed for new ways of thinking to take root. Art and culture, once dominated by religious themes, began to reflect this new preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of life, a movement known as the danse macabre. This shift away from purely religious devotion towards a more human-centered view of the world helped topple the old medieval mindset and clear the ground for the Renaissance, an era of incredible artistic and scientific rebirth. The Black Death was a tragedy of almost biblical proportions, but it brutally dismantled an old, rigid world, making way for a new one defined by the value of the individual. That plague ravaged Europe, desperate for new routes and riches, would soon send a man sailing into the unknown based on a colossal mistake. Christopher Columbus was convinced the Earth was far smaller than it actually was, and he believed he could reach the lucrative markets of Asia by sailing west. After years of pleading, he finally secured funding from the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, his three small ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, made landfall not in the Indies as he thought, but on an island in the Bahamas. He called the people he encountered Indians, a name born from his fundamental error, and he claimed their land for Spain. This single landing, a direct result of a navigational miscalculation, ripped the world in two and then stitched it back together in a completely new and often brutal way. The immediate consequence was the Columbian Exchange, a biological and cultural swap meet on a global scale that had never happened before. For the first time, the Eastern and Western hemispheres, which had evolved separately for millennia, were permanently connected. The Americas gave the world crops that would transform entire societies and diets. Think of the humble potato, a nutritional powerhouse that would fuel population booms across Europe, or tomatoes that would become the heart of Italian cuisine, or corn and chocolate. In return, the Old World sent horses which would revolutionize the cultures of the Great Plains, and sugar cane, a crop that would demand immense human suffering to cultivate. But the most devastating import was invisible. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which the indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity, swept across the continents like wildfire. It was a demographic catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale, with some estimates suggesting up to 90% of the native population perished within the first century of contact. This collapse paved the way for European conquest and colonization. The vast quantities of silver and gold looted from the Americas then flooded into Spain, financing its empire and fueling rampant inflation across Europe, while also creating the first truly global trade networks. The wealth generated from this new world financed wars, built palaces, and funded the rise of powerful new merchant classes. The world was no longer a collection of separate continents, but a single, interconnected sphere of trade, conflict, and cultural fusion. Columbus never knew what he had truly found, but his voyage, born from a simple error in calculation, set in motion the forces of globalization and empire that would define the next 500 years. While the discovery of the Americas opened a new world, the final collapse of an ancient one was already echoing across the globe. For 53 days, the massive walls of Constantinople, the legendary capital of the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, withstood a thunderous bombardment. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, had brought a terrifying new weapon to the siege, a colossal cannon so large it required dozens of oxen and hundreds of men to transport it. Each shot from this monster hammered the ancient stonework, but the defenders, led by their courageous Emperor Constantine XI, fought desperately to repair the breaches night after night. Then, in the early hours of May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Waves of Ottoman soldiers surged through a gate that had been left open by mistake, or perhaps through a breach in the damaged walls. The city was overrun. Emperor Constantine, refusing to flee, tore off his imperial regalia and plunged into the chaotic street fighting, dying anonymously alongside his soldiers. The last Roman emperor was gone, and with him, the final living link to the classical world of Rome was extinguished. The fall of this single city sent shockwaves rippling outward, changing the course of history in two profound ways. First, it slammed shut a vital economic door. For centuries, Constantinople had been the western terminus of the Silk Road, the crucial land route through which spices, silk, and other luxuries flowed from Asia into Europe. With the city now controlled by the Ottoman Empire, that route became dangerously unstable and prohibitively expensive for European merchants. This economic stranglehold created an urgent, desperate need to find another way to the riches of the East. That pressing need is what directly fueled the age of exploration, pushing navigators like Vasco da Gama to sail around Africa and ultimately motivating the Spanish crown to take a chance on a certain Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus and his radical plan to sail west. But there was a second, quieter consequence, a cultural and intellectual gift born from tragedy. As the Ottoman forces took the city, a flood of Greek scholars, artists, and intellectuals fled for their lives, carrying with them precious, ancient manuscripts of classical Greek and Roman knowledge. Most of them went to Italy, where they found refuge in the city-states of Florence, Venice, and Rome. These scholars brought with them a deep understanding of philosophy, science, and literature that had been lost or forgotten in Western Europe for centuries. Their arrival supercharged the Italian Renaissance, igniting a renewed passion for humanism, scientific inquiry, and classical art. The works of Plato and Aristotle were studied with fresh eyes, inspiring thinkers and artists from Leonardo da Vinci to Michelangelo. So the thunder of those Ottoman cannons did more than just topple an empire. It forced Europe to look outward across the oceans for new trade routes, and it simultaneously delivered the ancient wisdom that would inspire a new golden age of art and science right at home. That same ancient wisdom, rescued from the fallen walls of Constantinople, was about to meet a machine that would multiply its power beyond all imagining. In a workshop in the German city of Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was perfecting a deceptively simple invention, movable type. Before this, every book in Europe was a handmade masterpiece, painstakingly copied by scribes onto expensive parchment or vellum. A single Bible could take a monk an entire year to complete, and its cost was equivalent to a middle-class home. Gutenberg's genius was to break this process down into reusable components. He crafted individual metal letters that could be arranged into words, inked, and pressed onto paper. Once a page was printed, the letters could be disassembled and used again for the next page. This was the printing press, and it was about to shatter the old world of information. Suddenly, books were no longer rare treasures locked away in monastery libraries. They became commodities that could be produced in the hundreds, then the thousands. The price of knowledge plummeted. Where a handwritten Bible was once a fortune, a printed one became something a merchant or a local priest could afford. For the first time in history, ideas could travel at the speed of a horse and cart, no longer confined to the slow, error-prone hands of copyists. This single invention broke the centuries-long monopoly on learning held by the church and a small, literate elite. It created a new class of readers and thinkers who could access information for themselves. And when a German monk named Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, it was the printing press that turned his protest into a revolution. Luther's criticisms of the church were not left to molder on that wooden door. They were printed as pamphlets and spread across Germany and beyond in a matter of weeks, reaching people in towns and villages who had never before been part of a major theological debate. The same happened with the groundbreaking discoveries of the scientific revolution. The careful observations of astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo, which challenged the very place of Earth in the cosmos, were printed, debated, and built upon by other scientists across the continent. Knowledge was no longer a stagnant pool, it was a flowing river. This river of ideas would eventually swell into the Enlightenment, where philosophers used the power of the printed word to question the divine right of kings and argue for the rights of the individual. The very concepts of democracy and human rights that shape our modern world were born from debates that were possible only because a machine in a German workshop had made it cheap to share a thought. A single arrow lost in the chaos of a bloody October afternoon would decide the fate of a nation. In 1066, two armies faced each other on Senlac Hill in England. King Harold Godwinson and his Saxon housecarls, exhausted from just defeating a Viking invasion in the north, now stood against the Norman forces of William, Duke of Normandy. Harold's army held the high ground, a formidable shield wall that seemed unbreakable. For hours, William's cavalry charged up the hill, only to be hurled back by the staunch Saxon defense. The battle hung in the balance. Then William tried a desperate gamble. He ordered a section of his army to pretend to flee in a panicked retreat. It was a tactical feint, a trick to lure the Saxons from their superior position. The ruse worked. Believing victory was at hand, a large part of Harold's army broke ranks and chased the seemingly defeated Normans down the hill. This was their fatal mistake. Once the Saxon line was shattered and scattered, William's knights wheeled around and cut them to pieces. In the ensuing confusion, as Harold struggled to reform his lines, the story goes that a Norman arrow found its mark. It struck the king in the eye, mortally wounding him. With their leader fallen, the Saxon resistance collapsed. William the Conqueror had won the battle, and with it, a kingdom. The death of one king on that field ended an era. The Battle of Hastings marked the violent end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England and the beginning of Norman domination. William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, but his conquest was far from over. He systematically seized the lands of the defeated Saxon nobility and distributed them among his loyal Norman barons, building a new French-speaking ruling class. This single military victory reshaped England at its very core, with consequences that echo even in the English we speak today. For the next 3 centuries, the language of the court, the government, and the elite was French. Old English, the language of the common people, was suddenly the tongue of the conquered, but languages are resilient. Over time, they began to merge. The result was Middle English, a fascinating blend. We gained thousands of French words, often in areas where the Normans held power. So the Anglo-Saxon cow, sheep, and swine, tended by Saxon peasants, became the beef, mutton, and pork when served at the Norman lord's table. This linguistic class system is still baked into our vocabulary. William's administration was also ruthlessly efficient. To maximize tax revenue, he ordered the creation of the Domesday Book, a massive survey of every piece of property in England. It was so thorough that the English people said it felt like the final judgment of God, hence its name. For the first time, a king knew exactly what everyone owned, from the greatest earl to the humblest farmer, centralizing royal power to an unprecedented degree. He also restructured the feudal system, making every landholder, down to the lowest knight, swear ultimate allegiance directly to the king, not just to their local lord. This created a more unified state and a stronger monarchy, laying the administrative and legal foundations for the English nation that would one day challenge France and build its own empire. A battle lasting only a few hours did not just change a king. It forged a new England, its language, its laws, and its very identity born from that single, fateful arrow on a hill in Hastings. The power of kings, so dramatically cemented by William the Conqueror, would not go unchallenged forever. 2 centuries later, another English field witnessed a different kind of conquest, one not of land but of ideas. King John, widely regarded as one of England's worst monarchs, had pushed his barons to the brink through a combination of military failure and financial tyranny. He had lost most of England's ancestral lands in France, and to fund his desperate wars to reclaim them, he levied punishing taxes and seized the property of his nobles on a whim. The barons had finally had enough. In the spring of 1215, they raised an army and marched on London, forcing a confrontation. The 2 sides met at a water meadow called Runnymede, a neutral ground between the royal castle at Windsor and the barons' headquarters. There, on June 15th, they presented the king with a document they had drafted, known as the Great Charter or Magna Carta. With little choice and an army at his gates, a seething King John affixed his great seal to the parchment. The moment was less about a king granting rights and more about a king being forced to acknowledge he had limits. The core principles laid out in Magna Carta were revolutionary for their time. Its most famous clause declared that no free man could be imprisoned, stripped of his rights, or outlawed except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This established the foundational idea of due process, the right to a fair trial, a direct challenge to the king's power to punish people arbitrarily. Another clause stated that no taxes could be levied without the common consent of the kingdom, an early and powerful step toward representative government. In essence, the charter declared that the king himself was not above the law. He too had to govern according to established customs and legal procedures. In the immediate aftermath, the document was a spectacular failure. King John had no intention of honoring it. He immediately wrote to the Pope, who obligingly annulled the charter, declaring it shameful and illegal. Civil war erupted again, and the whole affair might have been forgotten as a minor footnote in a messy rebellion. But John died suddenly the next year, and his advisors, acting for his young son, reissued the charter to secure peace. Over the following centuries, this act of political desperation was resurrected again and again by English parliaments and common lawyers, who saw in its words a powerful weapon against royal absolutism. Each time they argued for their ancient liberties, they pointed back to Runnymede. The principles of due process and the rule of law, once scribbled onto parchment to curb a terrible king, slowly became embedded in English common law. Centuries later, when American colonists felt their rights were being trampled by a distant British king, they did not see themselves as revolutionaries, but as preservers of their ancient English rights, rights they believed were guaranteed by Magna Carta. Its spirit breathes in the American Constitution's Fifth Amendment, which states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Its influence even extends to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What began as a peace treaty between a tyrant and his angry nobles became the intellectual cornerstone for the very concept of limited government and the rights of the individual against the power of the state. The ink on Magna Carta had long since dried, but the question of who truly held power, kings or their people, remained a live wire across Europe. In the royal castle high above the city of Prague, that tension was about to snap in the most dramatic way imaginable. For decades, a fragile peace had held in the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of German states between Catholics and the growing Protestant nobility. The Habsburg emperors, fervent Catholics, had promised religious freedom. But when the fiercely Catholic Archduke Ferdinand was set to become King of Bohemia, a largely Protestant kingdom, the nobles feared a crackdown. Their fears were confirmed when Ferdinand began revoking their religious rights and sending Catholic governors to rule in Prague. On a morning in May 1618, a band of angry Protestant nobles marched into Prague Castle, confronted the 2 imperial governors and their secretary, and put them on trial for violating their liberties. The verdict was swift and brutal. In a shocking act of defiance, the nobles seized the three men and hurled them from a third-story window of the castle. It was an act known as defenestration, a political statement written in violence. The governors and their secretary plummeted nearly 70 feet to the cobblestones below. Then something unexpected happened. They survived. Catholic accounts immediately claimed it was a miracle, that angels had carried them to safety. A more earthy and likely more accurate explanation was that they landed in a deep pile of soft manure, a mode of refuse that cushioned their fall. But survival was not the point. The act itself was a deliberate and public rejection of Habsburg authority. Throwing someone out of a window was, in Bohemian tradition, a symbolic execution. It was a declaration of war, and war is precisely what they got. The emperor could not let such an insult stand. He mobilized his armies, and the Protestant nobles in turn formed their own alliances. That single theatrical act of violence in a Prague castle courtyard was the spark that ignited the 30 Years' War. What began as a religious revolt in Bohemia quickly spiraled into a continent-wide catastrophe. It was a war of unimaginable horror, fought mostly by mercenary armies who lived off the land, plundering and burning as they went. Towns were wiped off the map. The population of the German states was utterly devastated, with some areas losing over half their people to combat, famine, and disease. By the time the Peace of Westphalia finally ended the fighting in 1648, an estimated 8 million people were dead. The war had been so utterly destructive that it fundamentally rewired the political logic of Europe. The peace treaties that ended it established a new principle, that a ruler had the right to determine the religion of his own state. This concept of state sovereignty, the idea that nations are independent entities with control over their own internal affairs, became the bedrock of the modern international system. It was the beginning of the end for the dream of a unified Christian empire and the dawn of the era of the nation-state. From a pile of dung in a Prague castle ditch grew the very idea of the world order we live in today. Paris was starving, and the air was thick with the smell of bread that did not exist. A poor harvest and a bankrupt monarchy had pushed the city to its breaking point. For days, rumors had swirled of royal troops gathering to crush the newly formed National Assembly. The people needed weapons to defend their fledgling revolution. Their eyes turned to a grim, medieval fortress that loomed over the eastern part of the city, the Bastille. It was more than just an arsenal. It was the ultimate symbol of the king's arbitrary power, a place where people could be imprisoned for life by a secret warrant without ever seeing a judge. On the morning of July 14, 1789, a swelling crowd surrounded its walls, demanding the guns and gunpowder stored inside. The governor, Bernard-René Delaunay, initially tried to negotiate, even inviting a handful of representatives inside. But the crowd grew restless and suspicious. Then, someone shouted that the drawbridge was a trap. The mob surged forward. A chaotic, bloody battle erupted. They were not professional soldiers. They were shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers, armed with whatever they could find. They were met with musket fire from the garrison stationed on the towers. For hours, the fighting raged, a desperate struggle against stone walls and trained soldiers. The tide turned when a company of deserting French guards who had sided with the people arrived with cannons. Once those cannons were aimed at the main gate, the governor knew it was over. He surrendered to prevent a total massacre. The mob poured into the inner courtyard, and the great fortress, this monument to tyranny, had fallen. They found only 7 prisoners inside, 4 forgers, 2 mentally ill men, and a disgraced nobleman. The practical haul was meager, but the symbolic victory was everything. They had not just captured a building, they had captured an idea. The fall of the Bastille was a thunderclap heard across France and all of Europe. It proved that the people, when united, could topple the seemingly unshakable foundations of the old order. The king, Louis XVI, when told the news, could only ask, "Is it a revolt?" His duke famously replied, "No, sire, it is a revolution." the event was a point of no return. There was no going back to the absolute rule of the past. The storming of this single prison unleashed the full, terrifying force of the French Revolution. It gave birth to its core ideals: liberty, equality, and fraternity, words that would be carried by revolutionary armies across the continent, toppling ancient thrones and inspiring new republics. The world had just witnessed the moment a king's power was publicly and violently seized by his own people. The revolutionary fervor that redefined power in Paris was soon matched by a different kind of uprising, one that would challenge the very definition of power itself. On November 24, 1859, a London bookseller put a new volume on his shelves, a dense scientific work by a quiet, methodical naturalist named Charles Darwin. Its full title was a mouthful, but its core idea was a seismic shock on the origin of species. Darwin proposed a simple, yet utterly radical mechanism for how life changes over time, a process he called natural selection. He argued that in the constant struggle for existence, individuals with slight variations that gave them an advantage were more likely to survive and reproduce. Over vast stretches of time, these tiny advantages would accumulate, leading to the emergence of entirely new species. This was not a random process, but a relentless, mindless engine of adaptation driven by the environment itself. For the first time, someone had provided a coherent, evidence-based explanation for the breathtaking diversity of life on Earth, from the hummingbird to the giant tortoise, all without needing a divine creator to individually craft each one. The book was an instant sensation, selling out its entire first print run in a single day. But the applause was drowned out by a roar of outrage. Darwin had not merely presented a new biological theory, he had pulled humanity off its pedestal. If all life was connected through a vast, branching tree of common descent, then humans were not a special creation placed above nature, but simply another animal, an advanced ape that had evolved like all the rest. This directly contradicted the biblical story of creation, the foundation of Western society's understanding of its own place in the universe. The ensuing controversy was ferocious, played out in newspapers, pulpits, and scientific societies. The most famous confrontation came at a debate in Oxford in 1860, where Darwin's brilliant defender, Thomas Henry Huxley, fiercely argued the case for evolution against the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce. The intellectual battle lines were drawn, and they have never fully disappeared. Yet, the truth of Darwin's theory was too powerful to be ignored. It provided the unifying framework for all of biology, explaining everything from the fossil record to the geographical distribution of species. Its influence did not stop there. The idea of natural selection would later inspire the science of genetics, reshape philosophy and psychology, and even influence economic theories. With one book, Darwin gave us a new origin story, one that fundamentally altered our relationship with the planet and all the life upon it. Even the most idealistic of political murders can unravel a republic. On the Ides of March in 44 BC, the air in Rome was thick with tension and rumor. Julius Caesar, the dictator for life, made his way to a Senate meeting held not in its usual building, but in the grand portico of the Theatre of Pompey. He was about to be crowned with a conspiracy. A group of senators, nearly 60 of them, believed Caesar's unprecedented power was strangling the ancient Roman Republic. They saw themselves not as assassins, but as liberators. Their leader was Marcus Brutus, a man Caesar trusted so deeply it was said he loved him like a son. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators crowded around him under the pretense of presenting a petition. Then the first dagger struck. Casca's blow was clumsy, a mere graze. Caesar, in shock, turned and seized his arm, crying out in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" What happened next was a coordinated frenzy. The other senators drew their concealed daggers and joined the attack. Caesar, wrapped in his toga, tried to fight them off, but the blades kept coming. It was the sight of Brutus stepping forward that finally broke his will. The ancient sources claim his last words were not the dramatic et tu, brute, but the more heartbreaking Greek phrase kai su teknon, meaning you too, my child. He then pulled the edge of his toga over his face and fell at the base of Pompey's statue, stabbed 23 times. The assassins, their daggers dripping, raised their bloodied hands and shouted for liberty, believing they had just saved Rome. They were catastrophically wrong. The murder of one man did not restore the old republic. It shattered the last fragile pretense of its stability. The public reaction was not the grateful celebration the conspirators had expected. Instead, a wave of confusion and then anger swept through the city. Caesar, for all his ambition, had been immensely popular with the common people and the army. His death created a power vacuum, an abyss that no Senate could fill. Rome was plunged into a new and even more brutal series of civil wars. In the ensuing chaos, 3 men rose to dominate the shattered republic, a young man who seemed at first an unlikely contender, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted heir, Octavian. With a cold, calculating brilliance that belied his youth, Octavian forged an alliance with Mark Antony and Lepidus, the second triumvirate. Together, they hunted down and killed the assassins, Brutus and Cassius dying by their own hands after defeat at the Battle of Philippi. But this alliance was only a stepping stone. Octavian soon turned on his partners, defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra to become the sole master of the Roman world. The Senate, weary of decades of bloodshed, granted him a new title, Augustus, the Revered One. He was careful to maintain the shell of the old republic, calling himself merely the first citizen, but in reality he held all the power. The Roman Republic was dead. In its place stood the Roman Empire, a system of one-man rule that would last for centuries, dominating the Mediterranean and shaping the course of Western civilization. The senator's daggers, wielded to preserve a free state, had instead delivered its final, killing blow and ushered in the age of the emperor. A new sun bloomed over Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945. At 8:15 local time, the American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, released a single bomb nicknamed Little Boy. 44 seconds later, the world entered the atomic age. The detonation was an unearthly spectacle, a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, followed by a fireball that reached temperatures hotter than the surface of our own star. The shockwave that followed flattened everything within a 2-kilometer radius, turning a bustling city into a landscape of splinters and ash. Tens of thousands of people were killed in that single, silent instant, their shadows permanently etched onto the stone where they stood. Those who survived the initial blast faced a new horror, a black, radioactive rain that fell from the strange, towering mushroom cloud. Yet, even this cataclysm was not enough to compel an immediate surrender. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. The dual shocks of atomic destruction, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war, finally forced Emperor Hirohito to announce Japan's unconditional surrender, bringing a definitive and brutal end to the Second World War. The decision to use these weapons remains one of history's most agonizing debates. Allied leaders, most notably President Harry Truman, were presented with a grim calculus. A full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands was projected to cost hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, of Allied and Japanese lives. The bombs, for all their horror, were seen as a way to shock Japan into submission and avoid that protracted bloodbath. It was a choice between 2 terrible paths, and the atomic option was chosen to end the war swiftly. But the immediate end of the fighting was only the beginning of the story. The world now possessed a power that could erase cities in a flash, a genie that could never be put back in its bottle. The very nature of warfare and global politics was transformed overnight. The United States' atomic monopoly was brief. The terrifying logic of the arms race took hold almost immediately, pushing the Soviet Union to develop its own bomb by 1949. This mutual possession of apocalyptic weapons created a precarious stalemate known as mutually assured destruction, a Cold War doctrine where a nuclear attack by one superpower would guarantee its own annihilation in a retaliatory strike. This fragile peace, balanced on the edge of oblivion, dictated international relations for the next half-century. It split the world into spheres of influence, fueled proxy wars from Korea to Vietnam, and led to the stockpiling of arsenals large enough to end human civilization many times over. The shadow of that mushroom cloud has never truly receded, a permanent existential threat that continues to shape military strategy, arms control treaties, and the deep-seated anxiety of the modern age. Another kind of mold would prove far more benevolent, its discovery as accidental as it was world-altering. Alexander Fleming was not a tidy man, his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London was often cluttered with Petri dishes, some left for weeks as he moved between projects. Upon returning from a summer holiday in 1928, he began sorting through a pile of these discarded cultures. One dish containing Staphylococcus bacteria had been contaminated. A blob of blue-green mold was growing in its center, but what caught Fleming's sharp eye was the clear zone surrounding it. The bacteria had been killed, as if the mold had created an invisible protective moat around itself. Fleming identified the mold as Penicillium notatum, and he named its bacteria-killing secretion penicillin. He famously remarked, "That's funny, a scientist's understated way of recognizing a profound anomaly." He conducted a few experiments, finding the mold juice was non-toxic to animals and effective against other deadly bacteria. But he struggled. Isolating and producing enough of the substance to be useful was a chemical nightmare he could not solve on his own. For a decade, penicillin remained little more than a fascinating laboratory curiosity, a cure in a petri dish with no practical application. The real breakthrough came a decade later, on the eve of another world war. A team of scientists at Oxford University, led by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, desperately needed new treatments for the battlefield infections they knew would claim millions. They rediscovered Fleming's old papers and dedicated themselves to the immense challenge of mass-producing penicillin. It was a monumental effort, requiring gallons of mold broth to produce a single, tiny dose of the pure antibiotic. Their first human test in 1941 was a desperate gamble on a policeman dying from a horrific infection. They did not have enough penicillin to save him, but the treatment worked spectacularly for a time, proving its incredible power. The urgent demands of World War II finally provided the catalyst for mass production. American pharmaceutical companies joined the effort, using deep tank fermentation to turn penicillin from a laboratory novelty into an industrial-scale miracle. By D-Day in 1944, enough penicillin was being produced to treat every infected Allied soldier. A simple scratch, which would have led to a fatal case of blood poisoning in the previous war, could now be cured with an injection. This single observation of a contaminated dish ushered in the antibiotic age, a revolution that fundamentally changed our relationship with disease. For the first time in human history, doctors had a weapon that could reliably cure, not just treat, a vast range of bacterial killers. Pneumonia, syphilis, gangrene, and tuberculosis, which had been death sentences for millennia, were suddenly rendered manageable. Life expectancy soared. Surgery became infinitely safer as the risk of post-operative infection plummeted. The entire landscape of modern medicine, from complex organ transplants to chemotherapy, rests upon the foundation that antibiotics built. It is a sobering thought that one of humanity's greatest medical triumphs began not with a grand design, but with a messy lab and an observant, curious mind who saw something funny in a spoiled experiment. That single, relentless beep from the heavens was a sound that froze the world. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union announced it had successfully launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. It was a simple, polished metal sphere no bigger than a beach ball, with 4 long antennae trailing behind it, but its radio signal, that steady beep, 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 was a message of profound technological triumph. For the first time in history, a human-made object was circling the planet, and it was Soviet. In the United States, the reaction was not just surprise, it was a seismic shock of fear and humiliation. The public looked up at the night sky and could actually see a tiny, moving dot of light, a constant, orbiting reminder that a rival superpower had just achieved the unimaginable. If the Soviets could put a satellite into space, they could certainly launch a nuclear missile across the ocean. This was the Sputnik crisis, a full-blown panic that America had fallen dangerously behind. The beeping satellite was proof of superior rocket science, and in the context of the Cold War, that meant superior military capability. The American education system was suddenly put under a microscope. Politicians and military leaders asked a terrifying question: how could we win the race for space if our children were not winning in math and science? The answer was a national mobilization unlike anything seen in peacetime. The federal government poured billions of dollars into education, passing the National Defense Education Act to train a new generation of engineers, physicists, and mathematicians. The very curriculum in schools was overhauled, with a new, intense focus on rigorous science and mathematics, an effort to catch up and surpass the Soviet lead. But the most direct and lasting response came just 1 year later with the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. This was not just a new agency, it was a declaration of a new American purpose to seize the initiative in the exploration of space. The space race was now the central battlefield of the Cold War, a non-violent but fiercely competitive struggle for global prestige. The pressure was immense. The Soviets scored another victory by sending the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. Each success was a fresh blow to American confidence. President John F. Kennedy, understanding the stakes, made an audacious promise to the nation in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. That single goal, born directly from the humiliation of Sputnik, focused the entire nation's technological and industrial might. It drove innovation in computing, material science, and telecommunications at a breakneck pace. The integrated circuit, the very heart of the modern computer, was perfected largely due to the Apollo program's demands for small, lightweight guidance systems. The tremendous effort culminated on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong's boot touched the lunar dust. That one small step was the ultimate answer to Sputnik's beep, the final, triumphant victory in a race that began with a simple metal sphere passing overhead. The technological momentum did not stop there. The satellites that now enable our global communications, our weather forecasting, and our GPS navigation are all descendants of that first beeping pioneer. The world we live in, connected and informed in real time, was forged in the fiery competition ignited by a single satellite signal. The world watched in real time as the new century's first great act of violence unfolded. On a clear September morning in 2001, 19 hijackers seized control of 4 commercial airliners. 2 were deliberately flown into the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center, fiery impacts that tore gaping holes in the iconic skyscrapers. A third plane struck the Pentagon, the very symbol of American military power. The fourth, likely targeting the U.S. Capitol, crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. For over an hour, a global television audience witnessed the surreal and horrifying spectacle, a feeling of disbelief that turned to dread as the South Tower, and then the North, buckled and collapsed into immense clouds of dust and debris. The immediate aftermath was a world in pause. For the first time in history, all civilian air traffic over the United States was grounded, the skies eerily silent. The final death toll was staggering, nearly 3,000 people from over 90 nations killed in a single coordinated attack. but the collapse of those towers was only the beginning of the shockwave. The United States, under President George W. Bush, immediately declared a global war on terror, identifying the Islamist extremist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, as the perpetrator. In October, less than a month after the attacks, U.S. and Allied forces invaded Afghanistan to dismantle Al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban regime that had harbored them. This was followed in 2003 by the controversial invasion of Iraq, based on intelligence later disproven that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The world's geopolitical focus shifted violently from the old Cold War standoff to a new and diffused struggle against non-state actors and religious extremism. Domestically, life was fundamentally reshaped by a new security paradigm. The U.S. created the massive Department of Homeland Security, a bureaucratic overhaul on a scale not seen since the Cold War. The Patriot Act vastly expanded the government's surveillance powers, allowing for increased monitoring of communications and financial transactions in the name of security. Air travel transformed from a relatively simple process into a complex ritual of scrutiny, with the creation of the Transportation Security Administration introducing rigorous screenings, no-fly lists, and a culture of heightened vigilance. The attacks of 9/11 created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a realization that borders and oceans were no longer sufficient protection in an age of globalized threats. The world entered a long twilight struggle, one whose political, military, and psychological consequences continue to define international relations and our daily lives to this day. From the ashes of a fractured world rose a single man with a singular purpose. On the windswept steppes of Central Asia, a tribal leader named Temujin stood before a grand council, a Kurultai of all the Mongol chieftains. For centuries, their people had been locked in a cycle of bitter feuds and petty rivalries, a collection of warring clans easy prey for more powerful neighbors. But on this day in 1206, they declared their unity. They gave Temujin a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. This single proclamation was the spark that lit a fire which would consume continents. He forged the scattered, undisciplined tribes into a single, terrifyingly efficient military machine. He broke the old system of aristocratic lineage, promoting officers based on merit and loyalty alone. He instilled a brutal discipline and organized his warriors into a decimal system, units of 10, 100, and 1,000 that moved and fought with perfect coordination. The Mongol army became a whirlwind on horseback, a force of incredible speed and adaptability, masters of the feigned retreat and the composite bow that could strike with deadly accuracy from a distance. This new nation, born from that one council, exploded outward. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongol hordes conquered an empire that stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the sun-baked plains of Persia. It was the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, but the Mongol peace, the Pax Mongolica, was the empire's true, lasting legacy. For the first time in centuries, the entire length of the Silk Road from China to the Mediterranean was under the control of a single, stable power. The Mongols ruthlessly suppressed banditry and built a vast network of relay stations, allowing merchants, diplomats, and missionaries to travel safely across thousands of miles. This unprecedented connectivity created a superhighway for the exchange of goods, ideas, and innovations. Chinese technologies like gunpowder, the compass, and printing moved west into Europe. Persian astronomy and Islamic medical knowledge traveled east. It was a globalizing force a century before the age of exploration, a forced cultural and technological dialogue that reshaped the world. Yet, riding along those same protected trade routes was a stowaway, a silent passenger that would bring about the empire's indirect and most devastating impact. In the 1340s, Mongol armies besieging a Black Sea port used catapults to hurl plague-infected corpses over the city walls. The disease leaped from the besieged city onto the very merchant ships and caravans the Mongols had made safe. From there, the Black Death raced down the Silk Road into Europe, carrying a pandemic that would wipe out as much as half the population. So the single act of unification that created history's greatest land empire also, inadvertently, opened the highway for its greatest biological catastrophe, a stark reminder that even the most world-altering events can cast a double shadow. A single hammer strike on a church door in a small German town would echo for centuries. Martin Luther, a deeply troubled Augustinian monk, was not trying to start a revolution on that October 31st in 1517. He was following a common academic practice, posting a list of 95 points for debate, challenging the church sale of indulgences. These were essentially certificates purchased for cash that promised to reduce the time a soul spent in purgatory. To Luther, this was a corruption of true faith, a belief that forgiveness was God's alone to grant, not something to be bought and sold like market goods. His protest was meant for scholars and clergy, a call for reform from within. But the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church functioned as a public bulletin board, and someone took Luther's Latin theses and did something revolutionary. They translated them into German, the language of the common people, and handed them to a printer. The new printing press, that same world-changing machine we discussed earlier, took this scholarly complaint and turned it into a viral wildfire. Pamphlets containing Luther's arguments spread across Germany and beyond in a matter of weeks, reaching far beyond the university halls and into the shops and fields of ordinary citizens. For the first time, people were reading a direct, powerful challenge to the authority of the Pope and the entire church hierarchy. The response was electric. The church, of course, demanded he recant. Luther refused, famously stating, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He was excommunicated and declared an outlaw, but by then it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. What began as a call for debate had spiraled into the Protestant Reformation, a movement that would shatter the 1,000-year unity of Western Christendom. The single, monolithic authority of the Roman Catholic Church was broken forever. In its place sprang up a multitude of new Christian denominations, from Lutheranism to Calvinism, each with its own interpretation of Scripture and doctrine. This religious fragmentation plunged Europe into over a century of devastating wars, as kings and princes chose sides, often for political gain as much as faith. The conflict between Catholics and Protestants became the defining tension of the era, leading to massacres, forced conversions, and wars that ravaged the continent. The political consequences were just as profound. The power of the papacy was severely weakened, no longer able to command the absolute loyalty of Europe's monarchs. This created space for the rise of stronger, more centralized nation-states, whose rulers could now defy the Pope with impunity. The very idea of individual conscience and the right to challenge authority, even religious authority, was planted in the European mind, a seed that would later grow into broader movements for political and intellectual freedom. One man's act of conscience, nailed to a wooden door and multiplied by a machine, did not just create new churches. It redrew the map of Europe and reshaped the modern world's understanding of faith, power, and the individual. 13 days in October of 1962 held the entire planet in a breathless state of terror. An American U-2 spy plane, flying a high-altitude reconnaissance mission over Cuba, had returned with photographs that sent chills through the White House. The analysis was unequivocal. The Soviet Union was secretly constructing launch sites for nuclear missiles just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. These were not just defensive weapons. They were medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to Washington, D.C., and virtually every major American city on the eastern seaboard, with flight times as short as 5 minutes. For the United States, this was an intolerable and existential threat, a direct challenge that President John F. Kennedy could not ignore. His administration faced a terrible choice. Do nothing and appear weak, inviting further Soviet aggression. Launch a full-scale military invasion of Cuba, which would almost certainly trigger a wider war. Or impose a naval blockade, which he carefully termed a quarantine, to prevent more Soviet weapons from reaching the island. Kennedy chose the blockade, a middle path that gave both sides time to think, but one that also brought the world to the very brink. For 13 agonizing days, the two superpowers engaged in a nerve-shredding game of nuclear chicken. The U.S. Navy formed a line of ships in the Atlantic to intercept and turn back Soviet vessels heading for Cuba. The American military was placed at its highest state of peacetime alert. In Florida, invasion forces massed, while B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons circled in the skies, ready to receive orders. The world watched and waited, aware that a single misstep, one overzealous ship captain or one misread signal, could ignite a global conflagration. The most dangerous moment came on October 27th, a day known as Black Saturday. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Another U-2 mistakenly strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly provoking a response. Meanwhile, Soviet ships continued to approach the quarantine line. Behind the scenes, however, a frantic and secret negotiation was unfolding. Kennedy received two contradictory messages from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The first was emotional and personal, offering a way out. The second was more formal and demanding. In a masterstroke of crisis management, Kennedy chose to publicly respond to the first, more conciliatory letter, while his brother Robert Kennedy secretly assured the Soviet ambassador that the missiles in Turkey, which the U.S. had already planned to remove, would be taken out, but only if the Soviets kept it absolutely quiet. This secret deal was the key. Khrushchev, facing the reality of American naval superiority and the potential for a catastrophic war, agreed. On October 28th, he announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. The world exhaled. The immediate crisis was over, but its impact was permanent. The sheer, palpable fear of those 13 days forced a profound shift in superpower relations. Both sides had stared directly into the nuclear abyss and had been utterly horrified by what they saw. Just a few months later, the two nations established the famous Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct telegraph and later telephone link, to ensure that in any future crisis, leaders could communicate instantly to prevent such a dangerous escalation from happening again. This event marked the beginning of the end of the most confrontational phase of the Cold War. It led to the first major arms control agreements, including the Limited Test Ban Treaty, and ushered in a new period of détente, a conscious effort to manage tensions and avoid direct confrontation. The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as the single closest brush with global nuclear annihilation, a stark and lasting lesson in the fragile line between peace and oblivion. The digital age was born not in a corporate lab but on a physicist's desk. In 1989, a software consultant at CERN, the European Particle Physics Laboratory named Tim Berners-Lee, grew frustrated. He was surrounded by brilliant minds from all over the world, but their knowledge was trapped in isolated silos. Different computers used different systems, and finding a specific piece of information was a labyrinthine task. To solve this, Berners-Lee wrote a modest proposal for an information management system, a way to link documents across the network so that one idea could point directly to another. His supervisor famously labeled it vague but exciting. That simple proposal was the blueprint for the World Wide Web. It is crucial to understand that Berners-Lee did not invent the Internet itself. The Internet, a network of networks, had existed for decades as a military and academic project, a robust digital highway for sending files and emails. What Berners-Lee created were the universal rules of the road that made that highway accessible to everyone. He invented three fundamental technologies. First, Hypertext Markup Language, or HTML, the coding language that structures a web page, allowing it to contain text, images, and most importantly, links. Second, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP, the set of rules that allows web browsers and servers to communicate with each other. And third, the Uniform Resource Locator, or URL, the unique address for every single page on the web. Together, these three inventions transformed the internet from a specialist's tool into a global library that anyone could browse, read, and contribute to. The decision to give this revolutionary technology away for free, with no patent and no royalty, was perhaps his most world-altering choice. He believed it should remain an open, neutral platform. The effect was an explosion of creativity and connection unlike anything in human history. Almost overnight, the web rewired the very fabric of society. It dismantled geographical barriers, allowing a student in a rural village to access the archives of the world's greatest museums. It created entirely new economies, from e-commerce giants to the gig economy, reshaping how we work and shop. It changed how we learn, socialize, and fall in love. The web gave a voice to the voiceless and mobilized social movements across the globe, while also creating new challenges around privacy and misinformation. That single act of solving a workplace problem did not just create a new technology. It wove a digital nervous system for our entire planet, connecting billions of lives into a single, pulsating network of information and human experience. A single, confused answer to a question shattered a concrete world. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had been more than just a barrier. It was a brutal, grey scar across the city, a physical embodiment of the Iron Curtain separating communist East from democratic West. It was a death strip of guard towers, barbed wire, and orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. Then, on November 9, 1989, an East German official named Günter Schabowski held a press conference to announce minor changes to travel regulations. He was poorly briefed and tired. When a journalist asked when the new rules would take effect, Schabowski fumbled through his notes and replied, "As far as I know, immediately, without delay." That vague, mistaken phrase was broadcast live on television. It sent an electric jolt through the population. East Berliners began gathering at the border crossings in the thousands, demanding that the guards let them through. The border guards, utterly bewildered and with no clear orders, faced a peaceful but massive crowd. They were outnumbered and overwhelmed. With no instruction from a paralyzed leadership, they made a momentous decision on their own. Just after 11 that night, they lifted the gates. A river of people poured through, and on the other side, West Berliners rushed to meet them. Strangers embraced, dancing on top of the hated wall with bottles of champagne and tears of disbelief. The sound of sledgehammers chipping away at the concrete became the anthem of the night. This was not a planned political act. It was a spontaneous eruption of human longing, triggered by one official's bungled statement. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the single most powerful symbol of the Cold War's abrupt and peaceful end. That ideological struggle, which had divided the world into two armed camps for nearly half a century, was simply evaporating before the world's eyes. The momentum was now unstoppable. Less than a year later, the two Germanys, separated since the end of the Second World War, were formally reunified into a single nation. The collapse of the wall sent a shockwave through the entire Soviet bloc. If East Germany could fall, so could the rest. The satellite states of Eastern Europe threw off their communist governments in a rapid, domino-like series of velvet revolutions. This loss of its outer empire fatally weakened the Soviet Union itself, which formally dissolved just 2 years later in 1991. The bipolar world order that had defined global politics since 1945 was over. The map of Europe was redrawn almost overnight, with new nations emerging and old alliances reconfigured. A single night of chaotic joy, born from a bureaucratic era, did not just tear down a wall of concrete. It dismantled an entire world structure, ending a decades-long standoff that had threatened the planet with nuclear winter, and proving that even the most rigid systems can be broken by the sheer collective will of people. The opulent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles was a stage for vengeance disguised as peace. On June 28, 1919, German delegates were led into this dazzling gallery, a place purposefully chosen to humiliate them, as it was here that the German Empire had been proclaimed after France's defeat in 1871. They were presented with a document, the Treaty of Versailles, and given a brutal choice: sign or face a full-scale Allied invasion. They signed. The treaty's terms were not merely punitive, they were designed to cripple. It forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war, the infamous war guilt clause that was a deep national insult. It stripped away 13% of its territory and all of its overseas colonies, severing industrial heartlands and placing millions of ethnic Germans under foreign rule. Most devastatingly, it imposed staggering financial reparations, a sum initially set at 132 billion gold marks, a debt so immense it was impossible to ever fully repay. The intention of the victorious powers, especially France, was to ensure Germany could never threaten them again. But this single document, intended to end all wars, became a poison pill. The war guilt clause festered in the German psyche, a source of bitter humiliation. The reparations bled the nation's economy dry. To pay its debts, the German government began printing money with nothing to back it, triggering one of history's most catastrophic hyperinflations. People needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a single loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight, and the middle class was financially annihilated, creating a population desperate for a scapegoat and a savior. This was the fertile ground in which a failed Austrian painter and his extremist ideology took root. Adolf Hitler did not create the anger that fueled his rise, he simply channeled it. In beer halls and at political rallies, he pointed to the Treaty of Versailles, the diktat, the dictated peace, as the source of all of Germany's shame and suffering. He promised to tear it up, to restore national pride, and to make Germany great again. The treaty that was meant to build a lasting peace did the exact opposite. It built a trapdoor directly into a second, even more devastating world war. A cold January morning in California changed the American continent forever. James W. Marshall was inspecting the tail race of a sawmill he was building for John Sutter on the American River when a glint in the water caught his eye. He bent down and picked up a few small yellow flakes. He had them tested. It was gold. The two men tried desperately to keep the discovery a secret, knowing it could destroy their orderly business plans, but secrets of this magnitude are impossible to contain. A merchant named Sam Brannan took a vial of gold dust through the streets of San Francisco, shouting the news for all to hear. The frenzy began. The news traveled east not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap propelled by newspaper headlines and the electrifying power of word of mouth. President James K. Polk would later confirm the discovery in his State of the Union address, lending official credibility to the unbelievable stories. That confirmation was the starting pistol. In 1849, a human tidal wave of hope and desperation began moving west. They were called the 49ers, and they came from every corner of the globe. Farmers sold their land, clerks quit their jobs, and soldiers deserted their posts, all lured by the dream of instant wealth. They sailed from China, Europe, and South America, enduring brutal 6-month voyages around Cape Horn or risking the deadly fevers of the Panama shortcut. Others came overland in covered wagons, following trails that became graveyards for those who succumbed to cholera, starvation, or exhaustion. In just a few years, the non-native population of California exploded from a few thousand to over 300,000. This was not a gradual migration, it was a sudden, seismic shift in human geography. The immediate effect was the rapid, almost forced, Americanization of California. The territory was suddenly flooded with American citizens, their institutions, and their laws. The need for order in the chaotic mining camps and burgeoning cities like San Francisco created an urgent demand for a formal, organized government. Just 2 years after the discovery at Sutter's Mill, and bypassing the usual territorial phase entirely, California was admitted into the Union as the 31st state in 1850. This breakneck pace was a direct result of the gold rush, a demographic revolution that permanently tipped the nation's balance of power westward. But this rapid transformation had a dark and devastating underside. For the indigenous peoples of California, the gold rush was an apocalypse. The massive influx of settlers, miners, and prospectors led to violent conflicts over land and resources. Miners polluted rivers with sediment from their hydraulic operations, destroying salmon runs and traditional food sources. State and local militias, often funded by the government, carried out systematic campaigns of extermination against native tribes. Diseases against which they had no immunity, like smallpox and measles, swept through their communities. In a horrifyingly short period, the native population of California was decimated, falling from an estimated 150,000 to just 30,000 within 2 decades. The gleaming promise of gold for some was built upon the shattered lives and cultures of many others, a foundational tragedy that reshaped the human and economic landscape of the American West in a single, feverish decade. For 83 seconds, the sky over Lakehurst, New Jersey, was a perfect, silent inferno. On May 6, 1937, the German passenger airship LZ-129 Hindenburg was completing a routine docking maneuver when, without warning, its skin erupted in flames. The fire was hydrogen feeding on oxygen, and it consumed the massive Zeppelin in less than a minute. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. A sleek silver leviathan transformed into a grotesque skeleton of glowing girders as it plummeted to the ground. What made this disaster uniquely world-altering was not just the 36 lives lost, but the fact that it was happening live. Radio broadcaster Herb Morrison was on the scene recording a routine arrival report for Chicago station WLS. His microphone captured the entire event, his voice breaking with emotion as he famously cried out, "Oh, the humanity." Newsreel cameras also captured the terrifying spectacle, and within days, movie theaters across America and the world were showing the horrifying footage to stunned audiences. This was a new kind of tragedy, one witnessed not through written reports or still photographs, but in moving pictures and sound, a visceral, immediate experience of catastrophe. The image of the Hindenburg in flames became permanently seared into the global consciousness. The public's reaction was immediate and absolute. This single, visually devastating event shattered all confidence in hydrogen-filled airships as a safe mode of commercial travel. For years, the German Zeppelins had been presented as the pinnacle of luxury and modern engineering, the ocean liners of the sky promising a smooth, quiet journey above the clouds. Passengers dined in elegant saloons and slept in private cabins as they crossed the Atlantic. But in one fiery minute, that entire vision of the future turned to ash. The inherent danger of using highly flammable hydrogen as a lifting gas, a compromise forced on the Germans because the United States refused to export non-flammable helium, was now terrifyingly obvious. Who would ever board such a vessel again? The era of the great passenger airships did not slowly fade away. It ended that very night in New Jersey. Flights were cancelled overnight and orders for new airships were scrapped. The world, looking for a safer way to fly, turned its eyes and its investment toward a different technology, the airplane. While airplanes of the era were still noisy, bumpy, and limited in range, they did not carry a massive, explosive gas bag inside them. The Hindenburg disaster provided the catastrophic proof that sealed the airship's fate and cleared the runway, both financially and psychologically, for the airplane to dominate the future of long-distance air travel. A technology that promised a graceful future for aviation was instead consumed by its own fundamental flaw, a spectacular demise that handed the sky to its rival. On a chilly Christmas morning in the year 800, the Grand Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome was packed with worshippers. King Charlemagne of the Franks, the most powerful ruler in the West, knelt in prayer before the altar. As he rose, Pope Leo III stepped forward and placed a golden crown upon his head. The crowd, likely prearranged, erupted with a chant to Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans. The act was swift, deliberate, and utterly transformative. Charlemagne later claimed the coronation was a surprise, that he would not have entered the church had he known the Pope's intention. But whether truly unexpected or a carefully staged piece of political theater, the symbolism was earth-shattering. For the first time in over 3 centuries in the West, there was a Roman emperor again. But this was a new kind of empire, fundamentally different from the Caesars of old. The Pope, by his own authority, had crowned a king as emperor. This single gesture created a powerful and often fraught alliance between the papacy and the Frankish monarchy. It sent a clear message to the world, and especially to the rival Roman emperor in Constantinople, that the West now had its own source of imperial authority, one sanctioned directly by God through his vicar on earth, the Pope. This coronation revived the idea of a universal Christian empire in the West, a political and spiritual union known as Christendom. It established a framework that would define the entire medieval period, the notion that church and state were 2 sides of the same coin, 2 swords wielded by God to govern humanity. The emperor provided military protection and temporal order, while the church offered spiritual guidance and divine legitimacy. This partnership, however, was a recipe for future conflict. Who truly held ultimate authority? Was it the emperor crowned by God or the Pope who held the power to crown? That question would echo for centuries, leading to epic power struggles between popes and emperors over who could appoint bishops and who held the final word in governing Christian society. From this Christmas Day coronation grew the entity that would eventually be called the Holy Roman Empire, a tangled, 1,000-year-old institution that shaped the heart of Europe. Charlemagne's empire itself did not last, but the idea it embodied of a unified Christian realm under a joint leadership of Pope and Emperor became the central political ideal of the Middle Ages, laying the very groundwork for the map of Europe and the constant, defining tension between royal power and religious authority. The roar of the 20s fell silent in a single day. On October 29, 1929, a day that would be seared into memory as Black Tuesday, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange descended into pure chaos. A record 16 million shares were dumped in a frantic, panicked stampede. The ticker tape fell hours behind the frantic trading, leaving investors in the dark as the paper value of their holdings evaporated into thin air. This was not a simple market correction, it was a catastrophic collapse that exposed the deep, hidden sickness within the decade's glittering prosperity. The Roaring Twenties had been built on a fragile foundation of rampant speculation and easy credit, where millions of ordinary people had bought stocks on margin, borrowing heavily to get a piece of the seemingly endless boom. When confidence shattered, that entire house of cards came tumbling down. But the crash was merely the detonator, not the bomb itself. It triggered a chain reaction of economic misery that encircled the globe, plunging the world into the Great Depression. As stock values vanished, businesses could no longer get loans. They slashed production, cut wages, and laid off workers in massive waves. Unemployment in the United States skyrocketed to 25%, a staggering figure that meant 1 in 4 people who wanted to work could not find a job. Red lines stretched for blocks in every major city, and shanty towns, derisively called Hoovervilles, sprang up in public parks. The crisis was not contained to America. Desperate to protect their own industries, nations imposed crippling tariffs which strangled international trade. banks began to fail by the thousands, wiping out the life savings of millions of families who had entrusted them with their money. This widespread despair and economic devastation created a petri dish for political extremism. When democratic governments seemed powerless to provide bread or work, people turned to radical alternatives that promised strong leadership and national revival. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, already weakened by war reparations and hyperinflation, buckled under the strain. The Nazi Party, once a fringe movement, found a receptive audience among the millions of unemployed and disillusioned citizens. Adolf Hitler did not rise to power in a vacuum. He was catapulted into prominence by the economic chaos that started on Wall Street. The same story played out in other nations where fascist and communist movements gained strength by offering simple, brutal solutions to complex problems. The global collapse in trade and the rise of aggressive, expansionist regimes seeking resources for their struggling economies created the tinderbox that would soon be set ablaze by the Second World War. A single day of financial panic on a stock exchange floor did not just wipe out fortunes. It unraveled the global order and set the stage for the deadliest conflict in human history. A gust of wind lifted the fragile wooden frame for a few precious seconds. On a cold December morning in 1903, on the sandy dunes of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright lay flat on his stomach at the controls of the flyer while his brother Wilbur ran alongside. The machine lifted, fought the air, and then settled back to Earth after just 12 seconds and 120 feet. It was a hop shorter than the wingspan of a modern jetliner, but it was the first time in history a machine carrying a person had achieved powered, sustained, and controlled flight. That wobbly, low journey over the sand was the culmination of years of obsessive experimentation. While others were fixated solely on power, the Wright brothers cracked the true secret of flight control. They understood that a pilot needed to actively command the air, not just ride it. Their breakthrough was a system called wing warping, which allowed them to twist the wings to bank and turn, much like a bird, giving them mastery over the sky's invisible currents. They also designed and built their own lightweight engine and efficient propellers, solving the puzzle of propulsion where so many had failed. That single, short flight at Kitty Hawk did not just prove a machine could fly. It handed humanity the keys to the atmosphere. Almost overnight, the world began to shrink. Journeys that once took weeks by ship or months by land were suddenly measured in hours. The airplane tore down geographical barriers, creating a new, intimate global neighborhood. This new dimension reshaped every facet of human life. In warfare, it erased the safety of the home front, turning entire cities into potential battlefields and giving rise to air forces as a decisive branch of the military. In commerce, it created a global supply chain where fresh food and vital goods could be shipped across oceans overnight, fueling a new era of international trade. It transformed culture, allowing ideas, art, and people to intermingle across continents at a pace that was previously unimaginable. The relentless push for higher, faster, and farther flight would soon push against the very edge of space itself, with the rocket technology that powered the first astronauts being a direct descendant of the principles proven on that windy Carolina beach. The age of isolation was over, and a new connected world was born from those 12 seconds in the air. Dawn broke over the English Channel to reveal an armada of ships so vast it seemed to blot out the sea itself. It was June 6, 1944, and the coast of Normandy was silent for only a moment longer. Then the world erupted. The sky darkened with shells from naval guns, and the beaches where the first landing craft would soon open their doors were given the names Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. This was D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted, a colossal gamble to carve a foothold in Hitler's fortress Europe. The success of that single day, however, relied on a lie sold over many months. Operation Fortitude was a masterpiece of deception, a grand illusion designed to convince the German High Command that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. The Allies constructed a phantom army, complete with inflatable tanks and wooden aircraft, all positioned in southeast England. They broadcast fake radio traffic and fed false intelligence to known German spies who were actually double agents. Hitler became so convinced of the ruse that even after the real landings began in Normandy, he held his most powerful panzer divisions in reserve for weeks, waiting for an attack at Calais that would never come. This deception was the invisible victory that made the bloody, visible one possible. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, the soldiers who charged into the surf faced a nightmare. Machine gun fire from fortified bunkers swept the beaches, turning the water red. Men waded through obstacles and mines, their progress measured in inches and lives. The fighting was close, brutal, and personal. Yet, through sheer courage and numbers, they secured the beachheads. By day's end, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. This was the crucial turning point. For years, the Soviet Union had borne the overwhelming brunt of the Nazi war machine on the Eastern Front. Now, at last, a second front was opened in the West. Hitler was caught in a vise. He could no longer shift his forces freely from east to west. He was forced to fight a two-front war, a strategic disaster that no nation, not even the Third Reich, could long survive. The Allied armies, once firmly established in France, began their relentless push toward Germany, while the Soviets advanced with equal force from the opposite direction. The D-Day landings did not end the war that day, but they sealed its outcome. They were the decisive blow that broke the Western Wall of Hitler's empire and set in motion the final, inevitable collapse. A king chose his heart over his crown, and the British Empire held its breath. Edward VIII had been on the throne for less than a year when his desire to marry Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who was divorced and in the process of divorcing a second time, ignited a constitutional firestorm. To the modern world, this seems like a simple matter of romance, but in 1936, it was a profound crisis of church and state. As king, Edward was the supreme governor of the Church of England, an institution that at the time forbade the remarriage of divorced people if their former spouses were still alive. The British Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, made it clear that the government and the Dominions would not accept Wallis Simpson as queen. The people, kept in the dark by a press embargo, were utterly unaware their king was facing an impossible choice. Edward was given three options. He could abandon the marriage idea, which he refused. He could marry against ministerial advice, which would force the government to resign and trigger a general election, a dangerously political act for a constitutional monarch. Or he could abdicate. With a resolve that stunned the establishment, he chose the third path. In a radio broadcast to the nation, the former king famously stated that he found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. With those words, he stepped down, becoming the only British monarch to voluntarily relinquish the throne. This single personal decision, born from love, sent a seismic ripple through history. The crown passed to his utterly unprepared younger brother, who became King George VI. Shy, afflicted with a debilitating stammer, and never expecting to be king, George was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as a global symbol. His very weaknesses, which he fought tirelessly to overcome, became his greatest strength. When war with Nazi Germany broke out just 3 years later, it was this reluctant king, standing resolutely with his Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who became the embodiment of Britain's wartime spirit. He and his family refused to leave London during the Blitz, sharing the dangers and hardships of their people. His steadfastness provided a crucial anchor of stability and morale for a nation fighting for its survival. And then, the most lasting consequence of all, because Edward stepped aside, it was George's eldest daughter, Princess Elizabeth, who became the heir to the throne. She would ascend as Queen Elizabeth II in 1952, presiding over the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth and becoming the longest reigning monarch in British history, a constant figure through decades of unprecedented change. One man's personal choice, made in a moment of private passion, did not just alter a family line. It gave a nation the wartime king it desperately needed and ultimately delivered the modern monarchy we recognize today. A young French scholar stared at a copy of the ancient text, his mind racing through a labyrinth of symbols. For years, the hieroglyphs carved onto the Rosetta Stone had been an impenetrable mystery, a locked door to 3,000 years of history. The black granite slab, discovered by a French soldier in Egypt in 1799, held the same decree written in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and the beautiful, enigmatic pictures of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Scholars could read the Greek, which gave them the general meaning, but cracking the code of the pharaohs seemed an impossible task. The prevailing theory was that hieroglyphs were purely ideographic, each symbol representing a whole idea or object, a concept with no connection to spoken language. But Jean-François Champollion, obsessed with Egypt since childhood, suspected something more. His breakthrough came when he focused on the cartouches, the oval rings that encircled the names of royalty. He theorized that the Egyptians would have needed to write the names of foreign rulers, like the Ptolemy mentioned in the Greek text, phonetically, since their own language had no native word for such a name. He compared the hieroglyphs in Ptolemy's cartouche to its Greek spelling and made a stunning leap. The symbols were not just ideas, they represented sounds. He tested his radical idea on another cartouche, this one for Cleopatra, and the phonetic values he had deduced from Ptolemy fit perfectly. The code was broken. Champollion had proven that hieroglyphs were a complex, sophisticated mix of phonetic signs that spelled out sounds and ideographic signs that conveyed meaning. In that single moment of revelation, a silent civilization suddenly found its voice. The effect was instantaneous and profound. For the first time, scholars could read the words of the ancient Egyptians themselves. The inscriptions on temple walls, the texts inside pyramids, and the fragile papyri placed in tombs were no longer just beautiful art. They were historical records, religious hymns, and personal letters. We learn the names of pharaohs beyond the biblical accounts, understood their gods and their beliefs about the afterlife, and deciphered their administrative documents and legal codes. Egyptology was transformed overnight from a field of guesswork and romantic speculation into a rigorous historical science. The entire timeline of one of humanity's oldest civilizations snapped into sharp, clear focus, pushing the known boundaries of history back by millennia. This one intellectual triumph, the decipherment of a single stone, did not just unlock the past, it gave us back a lost world. The crackling voice from the lunar module was calm, but the data on their screens told a different story. Eagle was descending toward the moon, but the computer was overloading, flashing alarm codes no one had ever seen before. Mission Control in Houston made a split-second decision, telling Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin they were go to continue. Then another problem. Armstrong, peering out the window, saw the computer was aiming them directly into a football field-sized crater littered with car-sized boulders. With less than a minute of fuel remaining, he manually took control, flying the fragile craft like a helicopter, skimming over the boulder field in a desperate search for a safe, level spot. Back on Earth, hundreds of millions of people held their breath, listening to the tense technical chatter and the agonizing callouts of the remaining fuel. 30 seconds left, then a blue and white ceramic sphere decorated with 4 legs touched the gray dust. Contact light, Aldrin called out. Armstrong's voice followed, calm and historic. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. A collective sigh of relief echoed across the globe. They were safe, but the greatest moment was still to come. A few hours later, a grainy black and white image flickered onto television screens worldwide. It showed a ladder leading down from a strange, spidery spacecraft to a landscape of fine, powder-like soil. Then a boot, and then a man clad in a bulky white suit stepped onto the surface. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. With those words, Neil Armstrong fulfilled a dream that had captivated humanity for thousands of years. This was not just an American victory, it was a human one. The single, successful landing of Apollo 11 was the ultimate checkmate in the 10th space race, a decisive demonstration of technological and organizational prowess that began with the shock of Sputnik. It inspired a generation to look up at the moon not as a distant symbol, but as a place we had visited, fueling a boom in science and engineering that would drive innovation for decades. But perhaps the most profound legacy was the new perspective it gave us on our own world. The photographs of a beautiful blue and white marble, isolated in the black void, became an iconic symbol of unity and fragility. For the first time, we saw our home not as a collection of separate nations, but as a single, breathtakingly delicate planet, a shared oasis in the immense, empty cosmos. That single step onto another world did more than plant a flag. It forever changed how we see ourselves and our place in the universe. From a single monk's protest to a king's romantic choice, these stories reveal a stunning truth. History does not always move in slow, predictable currents. It can be shattered and reassembled in an instant by a single, unpredictable moment. The common thread weaving through these 30 events is not grand design, but the raw, chaotic interplay of chance, human ambition, simple error, and serendipitous discovery. A wrong turn, a spoiled experiment, a misunderstood command. These are the fragile hinges upon which the door of history swings. It forces us to reconsider our own place in the timeline. What seems insignificant today, a news story we scroll past or a local decision made in a distant city, could be the very spark that future historians identify as the moment everything changed. What minor event happening right now, barely a whisper on the wind, do you believe might one day be seen as the pivot that sent our world spiraling onto a completely new and unforeseen path? We would love to hear your own candidates for history's most pivotal single events in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey through the fragile threads of our past, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the greatest mysteries history has to offer.